Pop with Pop, Rashad Myers.
And I'm John, I'm Pop, the old man.
We're just, we thought this would be a good idea to kind of sit down with one another and share our favorite types of music with one another. So basically what we're going to see is two guys sharing music and finding out what the other one likes and why, and just going to try and keep it interesting for everybody involved. What we would like to also do is to thank our sponsors, 314 City Gear. They have graciously provided us with all this cool gear. www.314citygear.com is the website. So if you want to go on there, there's all kinds of cool stuff to check out. There's also Leah Myers, who happens to be my wife. She's with Keller Williams, and she's a real estate agent. She can be found on Facebook. And I also believe there would be a website. Make sure that everybody knows how to get in touch with her if they are in the market for a home or looking to sell their home or whatever the case may be. Well, okay. Yeah, well, anything you wanted to say?
Well, I'm just glad to be here, and I'm going to be talking about my favorite genre of music, although I enjoy and grew up listening to all genres, classical, a little bit of that, and country, and a little bit of jazz as it was getting started, and of course blues. I am a Mississippi guy, and I grew up on Mississippi blues. My father played a little blues as he grew up as a young man, and blues was all around my community as I grew up, and I got a chance to hear some outstanding blues artists as I grew up who were already famous, who had come to Chicago and then gone back to Mississippi, and so blues is part of my heritage.
Okay, well, and along those lines, it's kind of part of all of our heritage. If you think about the way that blues has influenced rock and roll, and the effects that hip hop has had on, I guess you could say, popular culture. It's also worth mentioning that blues and hip hop are two distinctly American genres of music. You won't find roots to that in any other countries except for the United States, and so it's something that's pretty important to us. I guess you could say it should be important to all of us. Really, it's part of our history, so it's part of our story, and we'd kind of like to celebrate that with you guys. Yeah. So with that being said, I am going to share with you my favorite MC of all time, the Notorious B.I.G, Christopher Wallace. I would say that he's probably in everyone's top 5. That's how a lot of MCs would like, and I say MCs, I guess I can get back to that, what that means, but that's kind of the litmus test by which rappers or hip hop artists are kind of measured. Like, who's your top 5? You know, so I would say, he would easily be on Mount Rushmore of rappers. And there's reason why, because of his smooth flow, expert storyteller, and he's very realistic in his descriptions, and I guess just the way that he tells stories, a lot of times about crime and his drug trade and all that good stuff, but I really just like the way that he puts his thoughts together. It's also worth mentioning that he is unique in that he didn't, when he went into the booth to record his albums and his records, he didn't carry in a notepad with all of his raps written down. He would memorize them all, and then just remember them and record them. So that's really, it's rare.
Where did he get started? Where is he from?
He's from Brooklyn, Bedford
Stuyvesant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, he's a New York MC, and no one in Brooklyn, everybody in Brooklyn knows who he is. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
So with no further ado, I'm going to play for you Juicy by the Notorious B.I.G. Okay. Oh.
Yeah. This album
There's
is dedicated
the lyrics.
to all the teachers that told me I never amount to nothing. For all the people that lived above the buildings that I was hustling from, that called the police on me when I was just trying to make some money to feed my daughter. And all the niggas in the struggle, you know what I'm saying? It's all good, baby. It was all a
Well,
dream.
what did you think?
It's interesting. I saw picked up some lyrics, some similarities to blues in this particular song. By the way, when was this recorded? This particular
This should have been like 1995.
1995. In blues, there are basically three themes that emerge in songs. One of three themes, sometimes three themes all in one song. It's about jobs, about relationship with the ladies, or it is about traveling. And so many of the songs that you hear from Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and B.B. King and others, the King Boys, it'll be about the idea of one of those three themes, and I pick up some of that in popular music as well, about moving on and relationships and so forth. And so I want to talk about my favorite all-time blues artist, and his name is Chester Arthur Burnett.
Okay.
A name that you perhaps have never heard before. You would know this artist as Howlin' Wolf.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've heard of
Howlin' Wolf was named after the 21st president of the United States, Chester Arthur. Arthur was inaugurated in 1857, 2 terms. So Howlin' Wolf was born in Mississippi, down near West Point, near Tupelo, Mississippi. As a matter of fact, in the old days, if you were to go to the Holiday Inn in downtown Tupelo, Mississippi, you would go into the hallway and you would see two big photographs, two big pictures of two artists. One is Howlin' Wolf, the other one was Elvis Presley. And there was a big bear in there as well. He was a singer, he was a guitarist, he was a harmonica player, and he did some writing as well. He was quite a talented guy. He was a big guy, about 6'5", depending on the time frame, anywhere from 250 to 300 pounds. In fact, one of his songs was called 300 Pounds of Joy. He was recruited by someone that we may know as well. There was a guy who was a talent scout, looking for talent in the black community, and he found a number of people, one of which was Howlin' Wolf, and that person was Ike Turner, we know as Ike and Tina Turner's band. Ike, in essence, found Howlin' Wolf and had him signed with Chess Records in Chicago in the early 1950s. And some of his songs include Smokestack Lightning, and that's perhaps a signature song. And I'll let you play it, and I'll talk about it a bit.
Okay. Okay. That's cool.
So what did you think?
Well, what really stands out to me about that particular artist is his unique voice. He has like this gravelly, larger-than-life voice, but then he also goes up high into a falsetto and sings. And it kind of it makes me think about that old Richard Pryor skit when he's like, "Back in my day, boy, you had to be able to sing to get some women."
Yeah.
And
Okay,
so
glad you cleaned that up.
It's unclear though to most people probably what he was even talking about in that song. So
that's true indeed. As I mentioned before, the idea of the themes of blues most often is traveling. And this particular song is called Smokestack Lightning, which is basically referring to a train, most particularly the Illinois Central Railroad train that traversed from as far south as New Orleans and stopped at the train station, Central Station in Chicago. So all through the Delta, from New Orleans to Jackson to Memphis, and then up through Southern Illinois, not to St. Louis. The train would go to Carbondale, Illinois, and if you went to come to St. Louis, you'd have to get off that train and get on another one. But stay on the train, you go through Champaign and ultimately downtown Chicago, and that's how a lot of artists got from the Delta, Mississippi to Chicago.
And is that why they all ended up in one place or the other? Like, not really a whole. I mean, there's Memphis, sure, But it seems to me like, you're either in Chicago or you were.
That's a very good point. If you're from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, obviously, and Arkansas, if you were an artist, blues artist, you would end up either going to Memphis and staying there, but many did not. They would get on that same train or get a car and get to Chicago. Only a few came to St. Louis and stayed in St. Louis. Howlin' Wolf was an artist that I like because of the reason that you mentioned, this tremendous gravelly voice and be able to reach the higher pitches as well, multi-talented in terms of the guitar and harmonica and singing and writing as well. And he was also an outstanding manager. We don't think of blues artists back in those days as being good managers, but he basically promoted himself, his own band. Mm-hmm. He hired his own musicians. He didn't have a manager. He set up all the club dates around where he traveled to, in essence. So he was a multi-talented guy in that regard. And let me also add, before I move on to another artist, he was able to assemble, in my opinion, one of the greatest bands of the blues era. In addition to Muddy Waters as well. Muddy Waters had a great band, and there was some conflict between Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf in Chicago. Muddy Waters played on the south side of Chicago.
Okay.
That was his territory.
Okay.
Howlin' Wolf was on the west side of Chicago. That was his territory. And they respected each other in the sense that they didn't play clubs on either side that belonged to the other artist.
Wow. All right.
And that was the kind of tradition. Albert King went to Chicago, and he played on the west side with Howlin' Wolf in that area. But what happened was, in terms of these blues bands, Muddy Waters had an outstanding harmonica player whose name was Walter Jacobs, or Marion Jacobs, Little Walter Jacobs as he called. And he's not from Mississippi. He came from Louisiana.
Can't all be perfect, I guess, huh?
Yeah, and he came and he played with Muddy Waters, and in my opinion, as I said, the greatest blues player of all times. And he and Muddy Waters had a spat, a falling out. And it became known to Howlin' Wolf that Little Walter Jacobs was available to play. And Howlin' Wolf on the west side hired Little Walter to come play with his band. And then that caused conflict between Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, a conflict that was never resolved up until their death, in essence. When I was living in Chicago before you were born, I was a student at Loyola University downtown Chicago, taking night classes. And one evening, after having traveled, I was a traveling salesman for the Midwest. I was traveling to Wisconsin, driving to Iowa, Southern Illinois, Central Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and so forth. So I came on a Friday night and had my class, got out about 9:30. I still had a lot of energy. I was not ready to go to bed and so forth. And I just happened to recall that Howlin' Wolf was playing at a club on the west side of Chicago. And I went over there about 10:30 on a Friday night, small club, and like a $2 or $3 cover charge. And I went into this little club, and I was kind of surprised with a famous guy like this. I thought it would be crowded with a number of people there. It was not. And I think I was one of the few young, at the time, black guys who were there. Most of the people at that club were not black. They were from Loyola. They were from DePaul University, Northwestern, and other schools like that in the area, coming to hear the blues. Blues was in this time frame was phasing out as rock and roll was coming in, and it was not really being appreciated by a lot of people. And so I heard Howlin' Wolf play, and I got close to the stage, and he had a box of harmonicas. He must have had a dozen harmonicas in there, and as he played different songs, he would use different harmonicas to play them. And it was just outstanding, different keys. And for my $2 or $3, whatever I paid to get it, I got my money's worth that Friday night, seeing Howlin' Wolf up live, up front, personal, close, and so forth. Almost could touch the guy. And that was to me a great deal.
I guess we'll segue on. I'm going to play for you now a song called "Hypnotized" by the Notorious B.I.G. One of my favorite songs of all time, just because of the way that he links and the way he moves from one rhyme style and from one rhyme scheme to another. And so just the way that he puts the words and ideas together is just super interesting to me, and I love it. I think I played it at the wedding, at my wedding.
Okay.
So
Okay.
here we go. Notorious B.I.G. Hypnotize. Okay. Initial reactions?
Still some reference to hometown of Brooklyn again here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and in that regard, I was wondering, some of the lyrics here are so indigenous to America. Would you have difficulty explaining the lyrics, understanding to a person who is not of this culture?
Almost certainly. I mean, you can see in the first stanza, it's even regional, like how he says Pink Gators, my Detroit players. That's because they have a distinctive way to dress.
Yeah.
Tim's from my hooligans in Brooklyn. Yeah. Timberland is a particular brand of boot.
Okay.
And it's like it's just like a very regional. He's referring to different styles that are popular in different regions, like saying he's been all over the place.
Right.
Like he's seen it all. He knows what's going on everywhere. And it's cool because he'll say some stuff like that, and then he'll turn around and say, like his nickname, he used to call himself Big Papa, and he says, Papa been smooth since days of underoos, like since he's been a little kid.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just think he's just showing off his mastery of
the language,
and taking these different ideas and making it so that everybody knows what it's like to be in underoos, you know.
Okay. Well, for people who live in Brooklyn or quote
Yeah.
in the neighborhood or in the hood, they understand many of these lyrics.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But if, in order to gain popularity, for example, if a person lived in the hood in London or Amsterdam or in the hood in Tokyo, they wouldn't understand any of the language being used here necessarily, would they?
I think they might if they had familiarity in the hip hop culture. A lot of the things that he's talking about it's like you kind of said, they're either talking about a job someplace or a woman or you know. The rap is just very braggadocious and like, so guys will talk about their style. They'll talk about, and there's so many references to style and different name brands that he brings up here: Decan, Y Versace, Moschino, Coogee. Like, he's just talking, and it's obvious that he's showing that he's mastered, like, from a fashion, and then also like, so they talk about style, and they talk about their relationships with women and how many women a guy can get. It's a young man's game. It's
right, of course, yeah, I understand.
So but I think the hip hop culture is one that's just so everyone is welcome, right? And he's spread love. It's the Brooklyn way. So it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. If you know these things and you're down with the culture, and I think that you'll come to understand these things that he's talking about.
So would I find a hip hop culture in Rome, or in Singapore, or in Sao Paulo?
Absolutely. Hip hop is insanely popular worldwide. Asia, very much so. And it's kind of Asia, in fact, is kind of a symbiotic relationship there, and we'll get to that in terms of like the Wu-Tang influence on music, and East Asian civilization influence on them, and why it's such a cool like melding of the two, and why it's been so successful worldwide. I mean, these guys still tour, and they still sell records in abroad. So these things, they translate. Poor people. A lot of the things that he's talking about here in his rhymes, like, it comes from the hood. It's
Right.
It's kind of like pizza. Like, where You take the scraps, the leftovers, the little tiny bits and nuggets that people don't want, and you take something and you make something beautiful out of it.
Okay.
And you'll find that especially with some of the beats and that you'll hear. A lot of times you'll find their old soul records, like a little sample of a soul record that you've probably heard a million times.
Yeah.
And they take it, flip it, and snip it.
I agree. I hear you. Yeah, I've heard that in the songs. What I found interesting is that in the case of blues is indigenous, an American genre, as you mentioned before, and it was able to attract audiences around the world, most particularly in Western Europe, where people spoke a little English. So I could go to a club in London and hear some outstanding blues. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, we were in Amsterdam and heard some outstanding blues artists, like from the Delta, Mississippi, in Amsterdam. And given the history of blues, as I mentioned before, during the 1960s, early 60s time frame, late 60s as well, blues fell on hard times in our country as people began to accept more rock and roll and more jazz as well. And artists like B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, Elmore James, and so forth had a difficult time getting an audience to play to or to buy their records. But then, as their music began to be heard in England, for example, by the Beatles and by the Rolling Stones and so forth, the Stones recorded music and brought it back here, and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over time, Americans began to really appreciate what they had here that had been brought back to them in part by the British groups.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Just kind of interesting movement, traverse of blues from around the world. It's a universal language in terms of, as I said before, the themes of jobs and relationships and traveling from one place to another. Getting back to that regard, as you well know, there is a English group called the Rolling Stones. Do you know where that name came from? The Rolling Stones?
Papa was a Rolling Stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his own.
That's a good try. But Rolling Stone, I'm a Rolling Stone, was the name of an outstanding blues hit by Muddy Waters back in the 1950s.
Okay.
And somebody asked Mick Jagger early in his career, well, what's going to be the name of your group? And he saw an album cover that said Rolling Stones. He said, we're going to be called the Rolling Stones. And the rest is history. That's the legend, at least.
Small group, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about, I noticed, in our listening of the first two songs, the N-word.
Yes.
These guys will throw it out there rather, wherever it fits or whatever. Now, while it's not part of my lexicon, I feel like I don't use it. I would sound awkward saying it.
Yes.
But when you hear that word, what's your reaction?
It's not a word that to your point, I would not use in public. But again, in Mississippi, it was not a derogatory term if one person of color, a black person, used it in reference to another person.
Right.
That's my good old blank.
Yeah.
But if a person who was outside that community, maybe a Native American, an Indian, or white person used that term, associated with that term, then was something derogatory.
Yeah.
And not respectful.
Yeah.
I could call you my boy.
Right.
And not mean anything negative about it, but not anybody. So it's kind of an in-group type thing.
Yeah, sure. Growing up in your household, I'd never heard you guys use the word, and I never became comfortable even using it. So I don't know. We never even had this talk about the word.
No, we have not. We have not. But your point is well taken. My parents sort of, and grandparents as well, lived in an era where that term was used, but they didn't use it. And let me also add, in that regard, they were ahead of their time in this area. If there was a thief in our little black community in Mississippi, he was not a black thief or a white thief. He was just a thief. that's the kind of environment that I grew up in. And I so much appreciate that because my parents had friends who were black, who were white. As a matter of fact, my mother was a nurse, as you know, your grandmother, and she worked with another nurse, a white nurse. They were only two nurses in this little clinic in our little town, and this white nurse was stood up at her wedding by a guy. And she never married, as far as I know. She never dated anymore after that. But anyway, she and my mother were about the same age. And every Christmas, birthday, holiday, this lady would give me presents and baseball gloves and what have you. And I thought she was part of the family. I know she looked different. She lived in a different part of the neighborhood than we did, but she was always in our house. My mother would visit her and take me with her to visit her in a very nice house downtown in the white community and so forth. And she was just another good friend, a good friend of my mother's and so forth. So my point is, having grown up in Mississippi in a segregated society, we had friends that were white and my father the same way. And so we didn't put a lot of emphasis on the color of a person. As you probably know, your great grandfather was half white, what we thought was half English. Turns out he was half Irish and half black, which made me, my mother, a quarter, made me an eighth, and you a fourth.
Backwards?
Did I get a make that clear?
Fourth, eighth?
yeah, exactly. You're an eighth. Exactly. So my point is, now I think because of my grandfather, whom I knew was a farmer, outstanding farmer, he didn't put a lot of emphasis, on race and what have you. He served in World War I, and he was an outstanding patriot, soldier, and brilliant guy. And he just saw people as people, individuals, not based on race, even though the society said you got to see people based on their color. He didn't do that.
Yeah.
And that's how I grew up.
Well, I just think I wanted to ask you that, like I said, because we'd never talked about it, and it seems to come up often. Like it's still something that I see people discussing, in the news, and why can't I use this word? And so I don't know.
We didn't use it. We did not use it, and I think it's because of I think in part because of my grandfather.
Okay.
Many people did.
Yeah.
In a negative fashion and so forth, and we didn't do that.
I see a lot of it, with I had some of my black friends at school and in college, and I don't really bristle at hearing it. It's like you said, it's kind of one of those things. It's an in-group word, but I don't know.
And strangely enough,
I was just never comfortable.
Strangely enough, we kind of associate that name, at least initially I did, with Mississippi in the South. Having lived in Chicago, I heard it a lot in the community in Chicago, in the neighborhood. And these, sophisticated people, educated, quote unquote, yes, they were using that word.
Interesting. So it's kind of backwards then. You saw more of it in the North than in the South.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the second song, let me mention a word about the artist first. His name is Elmore James. And Elmore James, unlike Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King and others, was not born in the Delta, but rather he was born in the flatlands, not terribly far from where I grew up. I was born in a little town called Richland, Mississippi, 2 counties from where I lived, about 40 miles from where I grew up and so forth. And Elmore James was born back in 1918, and he, like so many artists, caught that smokestack lightning. And he went through Memphis, but did not stay. Went on to Chicago and recorded with Chess Records, and did quite well there for a number of years. And then he came back to Mississippi as a famous artist and played around Jackson, and he even played at my high school when I was junior or senior in 1960-61. He was a famous blues artist playing at a local high school in a rural town in Mississippi. That was Elmore James.
Does Van break down or something?
No, that did not happen. but he came back and stayed for a while, and then that was 1960, 61. And then in 1962 time frame, he went back to Chicago and actually died in Chicago in 1963. But Elmore James was made famous. He was made famous idea using the slide guitar. The slide.
Oh yeah.
He's called the king of the slide guitar, but that metal slide that gave the guitar a unique vibration and sound. And he had a number of outstanding hits himself with that. And one of the songs that he made famous was called "Dust My Broom," and his band was called the Broom Dusters. Do you know what it means to dust a broom?
No, I do not.
Okay. That's an old Southern term, which meant that as ladies most often would sweep out the house with a straw broom, the broom would catch lint and dust. And as you swept, you would stop periodically and go to the door and wrap the broom against the ground or against a rock and get the dust out of the broom, and then go back in and collect more dust.
Okay.
That's called dusting my broom. Cleaning out the broom. That was Dust My Broom. When he made a song called Dust My Broom, famous. And the other song that we're going to play here is having to do with traveling.
Okay.
He's talking about the idea of leaving one place and going to another because of a failed relationship with a lady. He says in his song, "Look on yonder's wall and hand me down my walking cane."
Okay.
I'm going to be leaving. I'm going to be walking. And by the way, the word "yonder" is another term that I find most interesting. It's still used in England in proper discussions in referring to that which is afar. Bring me yonder's pitcher of juice or beer, or what have you. And that term has been able to survive in even old Mississippi in the South, and in the terminology. And my parents and grandparents used the word "yonder." Go over yonder and bring me something, and bring it back. And so that's the terms used, and that's the name of a great song, "Look on Yonder's Wall" by Elmore James.
Okay. Let's check it out.
Yeah.
Look on yonder's wall, hand me down my walking cane.
That's Elmore James, and he referred to his conflict. He spent World War II, portion thereof, in Guam himself, and returned to Canton, Mississippi. But he was a war veteran in essence, and so he mentions in the song that your husband been to the war, and I know he was tough. I don't know how many men he done killed, but he done killed enough. I don't want to be added to the list.
Right. You got it, man.
That's Elmore James. And by the way, that is his name. Unlike some of the artists, he didn't change his name, as in some cases like B.B. King or Howlin' Wolf. It's Elmore James is the guy. He has a couple other hits, one of which is called he misses his girlfriend, his wife or lady, and he starts to cry. And he wrote a song called "The Sky Is Crying."
Oh yeah.
Look at the tears roll down the streets.
I've heard that one.
Yeah, that's
I've heard
that's Elmore.
Stevie Ray Vaughan do that. Same with Eric Clapton.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these songs get recycled and remade and covered and all, whatever the term you want to use.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's pretty cool. But it's also confusing because you don't know who originally made it a lot of times, or I don't know who originally made it.
Yeah.
Just because different era or whatever. So.
But in addition to influencing a lot of other blues artists, it is noted that he influenced Fleetwood Mac, Can Heat, and the Allman Brothers as listening to his music over the years. Yeah. That's Elmore James from Richland, Mississippi, but as I said before, he came back and he lived even closer to where I grew up. He lived in a little town that you've been through called Canton, Mississippi,
Yeah.
which is about 20 miles north of Jackson. And you had relatives who also lived in Canton, Mississippi. That's an interesting little town in itself, in that we had relatives there. In the old days, back in the 50s, the 40s and 50s and so forth, people worked in sawmills in Mississippi. That was a great thriving type of industry, and sawmills would move from one town to another. So sometime back in the 1940s, a large sawmill moved from Alabama to my little town in Peleachi, Mississippi. And the town just boomed in terms of population growth, income. People were driving good cars all of a sudden and so forth, all because of the sawmill.
So did they would just move on though after some period of time?
After the wood was depleted in the surrounding areas of about 20 miles or so forth, 15 maybe, then the mill would move to another area where there would be a lot of new trees or high growth trees, in this case pine trees.
So would they, I mean, what was the rhyme or reason? Would they just log it all and then just take it all, or were there some regulations that would govern how much they could take, or
No,
they just
there
took
were
it
no
all and they
regulations.
just left?
They just left.
Oh my goodness.
They cut the trees, and the trees would come back in another 20 years. You'd have another growth of trees. They didn't do replanting as we do today. But my point is, they would come and cut the large pine trees, and the pine trees would be taken to, for the most part, paper companies to make like International Paper, which is the big mill up near Howlin Wolf's hometown in Tupelo, Mississippi, in that area. And then in Mississippi, where in my little town, in Peleachi, you had relatives on both sides of your family who worked at the mill, and when the mill left, it went to Canton, Mississippi.
They just followed it?
It followed the mill, and then when it left Canton, it went to another place in Louisiana called Hardwood, Louisiana. And you had relatives, the Pridgetts. You remember the Pridgetts?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Remember Augusta?
Yes, I do remember that name.
Augusta was a Pridgett.
Okay.
And she had two kids, a daughter and a son. I can't remember their names now, but you knew them as small kids and so forth. But her brother moved 1, 2, 3 times.
Wow.
And he died in Hardwood, Louisiana at that mill. That's the sawmill.
What was the name of the company? Do you remember?
I do not remember the name of the sawmill.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, work was that tough to come by, or just?
Well, you had
this
two
is just a
choices
very
back
good
in those
job?
days. You had two choices. You could work as a sharecropper on a farm, unless you owned the property yourself, or you could work in a public job such as a sawmill, basically. Now, I'll also add is that sometimes we think that the only thing that people did would work for somebody else, but black people in Mississippi, Louisiana, and so forth also had property. And sometimes they were the ones who hired other people to work on their farms as well as sharecroppers in some cases. And but it was a good job. It worked like 8 to 5, or maybe, I don't know, probably 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
And for the most part, 5 days a week. If you're a farmer, you don't work 5 days a week.
No.
Yeah,
7 days, yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And so it was a good job in my little town for that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see here. As we move on down the line, now we come to Sky's the Limit once again by the Notorious B.I.G. This one I like because of the message. This one is in stark contrast to some of his earlier work. A lot of his earlier work was, he would talk about, crime and selling a drug or whatever. Tell a story about something that he had gotten into. But this one's probably the most the most optimistic and positive song that he wrote and recorded. So I have. You guys probably always wonder why I have the sticker of his face on the back of my car and T-shirts and
yes, we do.
I like how he's a complex person, and I think that a lot of times, especially nowadays, people have the tendency to evaluate another person that they don't know and say that person's either good or that person's either bad.
Yes.
Well, this person, depending on the circumstances where he's been through, where he came from, he can be a lot of things. Like he can be someone who's a devoted father, which we've heard him talk about his daughter. He can be a hustler, someone who's intensely motivated to be successful. And what I find a lot of the time is that when it comes to poor black guys who are trying to be successful and hustling, it's seen as a bad thing. And when if it's like, say, a white-owned company that comes and logs an entire swath of land, well, that guy's just making smart, savvy business moves.
Right.
So I try to separate like what some of the content from the artist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
And just kind of judge the art for what it is.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that impressed me about the hip hop artist is their ability to capture things in society and put them into lyrics that people can identify with. And they tend to memorize, not so much writing things down, but certainly to get on stage and memorize these long, long lines that rhyme. I find it most impressive.
I do too. I can't remember very much. I can't remember like an entire, a whole set.
Yeah.
And these guys have multiple sets and all these songs and entire CDs just. Just memorized. And
it reminds me of Johann Sebastian Bach in that regard, in memorizing things.
How so?
You probably remember is that Bach would compose a particular piece of music, a symphony, during the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and so forth. And he would set it aside. He'd written all these very, very complex lyrics and so forth. And he would play it and practice it on through the week and so forth. Set it aside and then let it rest on Saturday. And then on Sunday, he would go to the cathedral and play it without looking at the music.
Oof.
And that's what these artists remind me of, when they can get on the stage and remember these very long, complex lyrics that they have written sometime in the past, and just comes to them and they deliver it. That's what Bach did. Though these guys are kind of Bachs.
Kinda. I mean, that's It's a certain skill for sure. So let's get into Sky's the Limit, and I'll see what you think about that.
Baby, look at me. Mama love you. And I know you ain't no little boy no more, but you'll always be my baby. It seems like only yesterday I was holding you in my arms.
No, got that.
Now look at you now, big.
Yeah, I'll take
But I worry about you. I worry about you all the time. Hanging out on the corner all times of night with the cool people. Baby, that ain't nothing but trouble.
That reminds me of someone.
That you can have whatever you dream.
Mom,
Well, I want you to hold
hanging
on
out,
to that dream.
that ain't nothing but trouble.
Hold on to
Although
it.
she didn't say it like that.
Because the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
I've heard that speech before.
Yeah. Here's the N word again, huh?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Probably.
How's everybody doing tonight? I'd like to welcome to the stage the lyrically acclaimed. Ha. I like this young man because when he came out with the phrase, he went from ashy to classy. I like that. So
Yeah.
everybody in the house, give a warm round of applause for the Notorious B.I.G. The Notorious B.I.G., ladies and gentlemen. Give it up for him, y'all. A nigga never been as broke as me. I like that. When I was young, I had 2 pair of leads. Besides that, the
Like a beat.
pinstripes and the gray. The one I wore
There's some
on
great
Mondays
lyrics there.
and
I
Wednesdays.
thought good matching lyrics that made sense, but I think it's just a good beat. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
I thought like the description of how he came up.
Yes.
Became more popular with made friends as he got more money and got more attention from girls. And I thought that was I thought it was clever. It's brilliant. This is a brilliant song, I think. He's talking about owning 2 pair of jeans and sewing tigers and alligators on his shirt to pass off the name brands.
Yeah, Lee jeans most particularly.
Yeah, Lee jeans.
Most people don't. Is Lee still around?
I have no idea.
It was very popular during my day, in that regard. But the very name of the song is also encouraging. The sky is the limit, and he talks about keep on pushing. If you're trying something and it doesn't work, he mentioned several times, keep pressing. The sky is the limit. Keep pressing on. The sky is the limit. You can have what you want.
Yeah.
Great lyrics.
Yeah.
So
I think so too.
Very encouraging in that regard. The next one is an artist whose name that you don't know offhand. His name at birth was McKinley Morganfield, and you know him as Muddy Waters.
Wow.
And Muddy Waters was born back in 1913 in Issaquah County, Mississippi. That's a little county near Rolling Forks, Mississippi, in the delta of that area. And Muddy Waters, as you probably know, is considered the father of modern blues. And one of my claim to fame is that when you were a little boy living in Wheaton, Illinois, I was en route to Indiana overnight in the spring of 1983, and Muddy Waters had just died, and I stopped on my way to Indiana to the south side of Chicago at a funeral home where there was a wake for Muddy Waters, and so I got a chance to go in and view the body and so forth at the wake.
Respects, yeah.
And out in there were so many people there. It was just a mob, and there were all kind of blues artists from all around the country, around the city as well, who had come and to pay their respects. But in talking to people around the area, the one person who had not shown up was a blues artist by the name of Bobby Blue Bland.
Why didn't he show up?
Well, I don't know, and I had to leave. I left probably around 8:30, but I did hear later on about 9 o'clock or some of that area. Bobby Bland showed up. He came from out of town. He didn't live in Chicago, but he did show up. My point is, many of the artists who were in the country came to that wake that night and the funeral the next day, and I was there in spring of 1983, and also when we lived in Wheaton, Illinois. Muddy Waters moved from the city to the suburbs, out in DuPage County where we lived.
Oh.
He lived in a little town called Westmont, Illinois, which was from our house in Wheaton. It probably was about a 10-minute drive. And in the summers, back in those days when he moved out there, he would give a free concert, which I also attended on one occasion in the park in Westmont, Illinois, to all the people in the residence. Then people from Chicago came around as well. But he was quite an artist, and I identified with him because of his background and Mississippi and moving forward and becoming really, as I said, the father of blues. And he had the ability to sing well. He played guitar, he played harmonica, and he wrote songs. Okay. He was quite a talented guy, and he grew up on a cotton plantation in Mississippi and signed with Chess Records, and the rest became history. And that's Muddy Waters. Let me also add, in terms of Muddy Waters, in addition to being a great artist himself, he put together, in my opinion, the best band, even though my favorite is Howlin' Wolf. The best band in blues was formed by Muddy Waters. He had playing with him on guitar, Jimmy Rogers, outstanding guitarist. On drums, Elvin Evans. And on piano, the very, very famous Otis Spann. And then on top of that, those three, he had signed with his group for a period of time, the same person I mentioned before, Little Walter Jacobs, the greatest harmonica player in the world.
Okay.
Wow. All that with Muddy Waters. Can you believe what kind of sound they made. Some of the best sounds in the world. That's Muddy Waters. And then on top of that, there was a bassist, a guy who played bass. Also, he also did some recording of himself. But he was sort of a recruiter for Chess Records. But he was a bassist, and he was a songwriter. He wrote a number of songs for Muddy Waters, and he was from Vicksburg, Mississippi, the town in which I taught high school for 1 year.
Okay.
I taught high school science in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the hometown of this person whose name is Willie Dixon. Dixon was playing along with Otis Spann and Evan Ellis and Jimmy Rogers with Muddy Waters.
Okay. Willie Dixon. All right.
And we're going to listen to Muddy Waters and his great hit, Hoochie Coochie Man.
I just wanna tell my mother before I was born, you got a boy child coming. He gonna be a son of a gun. He gonna make pretty women jump and shout. Then they really wanna know what this all about. But you know I'm here. Everybody knows I'm here.
That's the mighty Muddy Waters.
That's one of the most famous riffs that you'll ever hear in music, in my opinion.
Yep. This is true. Yep. And that comes from the guitar player, Jimmy Rogers, and the bassist, Willie Dixon. Well, in terms of this particular song, Hoochie Coochie Man, what does that refer to, do you think? What is a Hoochie Coochie Man?
I was going to ask you the same thing. I don't know. Is it someone who's just very, very popular with ladies, or?
That's it, exactly. So, someone very popular with the ladies, and one gains popularity with the ladies in this connection here, this song, by way of voodoo or having a mojo hand. Do you know what a mojo hand is?
Is it like Black Cat Bone?
Yes, that's Black Cat Bone. And the
Like,
John DeConker root. Exactly. So
Yeah.
what I'm getting
What's it
to
called?
is
Spanish fly type stuff? The same
yes,
thing?
exactly
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
What I'm getting to is that the Delta blues had some bit of influence by New Orleans in this regard.
Yeah.
And New Orleans, as you well know, is the hometown of the voodoo arts that was developed or brought in from Africa and from the Caribbeans by the people there, mixed in with the Acadians from Canada, and they became the center of black arts. And so, in my little hometown of Peleachi, Mississippi, we had voodoo artists in our town who, if you wanted to get a job, if you wanted to attract a particular lady, you would go to this particular person,
Right.
and he would give you a portion of something. Most often, not to drink or to take, but most often it would be a mixture of something he puts together, and you would go and sprinkle it at this person's house, around their doorstep, or all around house, and then that would cause that person to
Do what you wanted?
exactly.
Oh my goodness.
And that was the voodoo man, and we also had a lady who did the same thing.
Did you ever buy any?
No, I did never bought.
Come on, man, you can tell me.
Muddy, let me also add, Muddy Waters did a lot of tours. Now, he played on the South Side when he was in town, but he was traveling the whole country. Howlin Wolf didn't travel very much. Howlin Wolf pretty much stayed at home. Howlin Wolf had 2 daughters. Disregarding his lyrics, Howlin Wolf was a dedicated family man. He had 2 daughters. He spent time with his daughters and his wife. And as I said, he was a manager. And he, as it turns out, as far as I remember, he had at the end of his lifespan more money than any other artist that I knew about, because he was a manager, and he was very, very rigid in terms of how he handled his money and so forth. And he did very, very well. And his little house on the west side of Chicago is like a 3-bedroom bungalow. You know, it's not much bigger than the downstairs here, and that's where he stayed all of his career, basically. Although he was making a lot of money, he was still, and now that is a historical site on the west side of Chicago.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Not terribly far from the arena where basketball is played, where the Bulls plays.
Yeah.
Not too far from that.
Okay. Well, cool.
Yeah.
Well, that was cool. I certainly learned a lot about the blues and enjoyed listening to some of my favorite songs. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I did mention Jay-Z, and he happens to be the next artist on the next episode.
Okay.
So right now we're going to thank our listeners. Thank you guys for listening. Thank our sponsors, 314 City Gear, Leah Myers, Realtor. I want to thank Q, who's on the camcorder here for the YouTube viewership. And so we will see you guys next time. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, indeed.